On behalf of WT Partnership, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's panel. That's Susie Henderson, the North American leader, Infrastructure Investment and Economics at GHD Advisory. She is also a board member of Waterfront Toronto and co-chair of the Quayside Committee, which oversees the potential smart city development with Sidewalk Labs. Susie is highly respected for her strong strategic positioning and her strong work to champion developing companies. She's also known for her ability to connect parties and develop innovative consortiums on investments in strategic infrastructure assets and navigating through complex situations with multiple high-profile stakeholders. Please join me in welcoming Susie and the panel.
Well, thank you so much, Philip. Appreciate that very kind introduction. We have plenty of room if people wish to come more into the centre. Please feel free, because it will help us focus when projecting ourselves to the audience. But if you would please come across, that would be really great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us at this hard hour, 4 o'clock on a day that's been intensive, full of learning and different opinions and conversations out there in this great conference. So without further ado, let me introduce these amazing and somewhat, underachieving panellists today, doing amazing things in all their own fields. And it's a very important topic that we're here to discuss today, and that is one of getting infrastructure projects for First Nation communities funded, but most importantly, once the funding's there, getting them shovel-ready and getting them to be delivered and effective within these communities. So very important. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Mr. Alan Clark. Alan is an Ottawa-based consultant on Indigenous issues. Previously, Alan served over 30 years, can't be true, can it? In the public service of Canada, most recently with Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. Welcome, Alan. Next to Alan, we've got Chief Miskokomon, who is currently serving the Southwest Regional Deputy Grand Chief of the Anishinabek Nation. Welcome, Chief Joe. Jason Calla, who has worked... we're very pleased to say that we have an A on your name.
Thank you.
Thank you. Not to be underestimated with our talents up here. He's worked for First Nations at the local, regional and national level for the last 20 years and is a key voice of the proposed First Nation Infrastructure Institution, which we're going to hear a lot more about today. And lastly, but by no means least, we have Chief Corrina Leween, Chief of the Cheslatta Carrier Nation. Welcome. I'm sure many of you probably know or are familiar with these great panellists today, but for your information, each of their more detailed bios are in the conference program for your reference and for you to refer at your convenience. We also are going to be very progressive and we'll be open to questions from the audience via the conference app, and they're going to come up throughout the screen during the session, and I'm sure our good friends will put up the here we go, right on cue on how to submit those questions. So we're going to try and incorporate that in our conversation today, if we can. But of course, it's a nice, intimate group here, so we might even also go old school. If anyone has a question, don't hesitate to raise your hand. Okay, so first question goes to Chief Joe. We're going to kick off with you. Okay, hands on buzzers. What we'd like you to, we'd just like to really set the scene here for this conversation, and really that is about outlining and describing the current state of infrastructure in your First Nation community. What are you seeing are the key needs, and how is the community rallying around that? If you could just give us a snapshot into that, and I know yourself and Chief Corrina are quite different in both of your nations, and I'd like to, speak to both of you about that. Over to you, Chief Joe.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to recognize that we're in the territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit. Our communities, the ones that are generally classified as middle-sized communities, and that's anywhere from about 2,000 people to 3,000 people. We're roughly 2,700 people with about half on reserve. Our challenge is that we cannot receive any kind of commitment that there is going to be ongoing capitalization for projects that need to take place. We have a water system that is over 20, going on 25 years old, with a filtration system that was just a bunch of add-ons as it grew, as the community grew. The piping system is too small. If we had 2 fires in our community today, the system would collapse on itself. It does not have the capacity in order to have fire suppression. Water quality, up until a few years ago when I was chief, was at times risky, very risky. There's a way of gauging and reading your water system in terms of nitrates. In the springtime, we were getting out of, when it hits a 10, mark of 10, you have a water quality crisis. We were fortunate enough, but we were always in about the 9.5 to 9.8, right on the verge of having the system go down. So I not only represent my community, but I represent also as an executive member 39 other First Nations. I go from Thunder Bay to Ottawa, all the way straight back to Sarnia. So we have a tremendous territory. Some small communities, which I'll leave the chief to talk about, other larger communities, other what's classified as big communities, over 8 to 10,000 people. So the range of water systems, the range of housing repairs, the range of infrastructure is all along a very large spectrum. And some of those communities have significant challenges for being in the north, where transportation systems are more difficult to get to, some in isolation, some on islands, some in very urban settings. Sarnia, the Chippewas, the Anishinabek First Nation is inside the city of Sarnia. So there's a large degree of variance as we look at the kinds of systems and the kinds of capacity and professionals that we have in each one of those communities.
Thanks, Chief Joe. So just to recap on that, what you're seeing as the key issues in infrastructure shortfall is in the water area and the housing area.
Those are
two examples.
Those are the primary ones, but you still have to get the wastewater, you have to have road constructions, you have to have bridges, you have to have culvert. I mean, like, when you're running a community, you know, you've got to take in, before you build a house, do you have the connectivity to that house, you know? We don't even have, living 20 miles outside of the city of London, we don't even have high-speed internet. So you can't put systems in unless you get those kinds of infrastructure into your community first. And how do you ever attract economic development when the government says, we want you to be self-sufficient? Well, great. I got gravel roads, I got the highways that we have and they're breaking down. We don't have the proper, we can't put another building on water. We have no wastewater management. And you want us to be economically viable? It's been only 7 years ago that I first got gas into our community that we connected up to our public system. So, you know, the challenges of attempting to attract business to come in and are interested in listening to people say, the governor of Puerto Rico spoke at lunch.
Yes.
You know, he talks about a zero tax base. We have a zero tax base. You want to invest your money? You come see me. Don't go to Puerto Rico.
You heard it here first, everybody. You heard it here first. Chief Corrina, can we move over to you to reflect on your First Nation as well, on those, what you're seeing as the greatest infrastructure needs? I know there's a description that Joe just gave about the size and scale, but still the fundamental issues about the community that, you know, there's gaps within in terms of infrastructure. How are you seeing it within your community? And for those within the room, could you just explain your community so that we get everyone on the same page as well?
Sure, thank you. I too would like to acknowledge that we are on the Mississaugas of New Credit territory, and I'm thankful that they're allowing me on their territory to do business that we're doing today. So Cheslatta Carrie Nation is a community of total population of about 350 people, and of those, half live on reserve and half live off reserve in the cities that surround us. Our community is a unique community in that when our people were flooded out by the Aluminum Company of Canada in 1952, we were moved into the Wet'suwet'en territory, which is not our traditional territory. Our traditional territory is the Carrier people. So we were moved probably about 60 miles from our traditional lands and spread out over a vast amount of about 174 miles between our first parcel and our last parcel. So coming from a community that was a community and spread out over this vast area has had like a lot of social impacts. But when we're talking about infrastructure in our community, it makes it very difficult to provide infrastructure when that distant factor is there. We are an semi-isolated community, which is another factor. And in the area that we live in, we have a huge issue with the drinking water, where we've got arsenic, where we've got mercury, we've got all the contaminants that's in our groundwater. So we have developed a water treatment facility in our community that supports the entire Southside community, which is about 2,000 people, non-First Nations as well as 3 First Nations that live there. Some of the gaps that we see within our community is very similar is housing, is the infrastructure that we need to actually do the business that we have to do in our community. Currently, we're housed in an old schoolhouse that we run our administration office out of. We have very few supportive services because of infrastructure, lack of. And the funding that goes and is attached to the infrastructure is another huge problem, that we can't acquire some of the funding that we need. We have administration buildings that are not even on reserve because of the lack of infrastructure. Roads, another issue, because we've got 175 miles of it, is to maintain, is another issue. Having a gathering place in our community. Currently, we don't have a gathering place. If we have, say, a funeral or a wedding or a huge gathering, we have to rent the community hall instead of having it right on our pieces of land. Some of the other, I think too, when we talk about infrastructure, we need to always remember that there's a social part of what infrastructure is. Our people are our foundation, basically. So the infrastructure to me also must include the social impacts in our communities from the move, from all the residential schools, systems, those kind of things. So the natural resources are there, and they're also in the form of our people. So when we don't have schools to, teach our children, and we have to send them out of the community, it's just another impact on our people. So
there's a lot of common overlap there with both of those answers.
if we had 100 chiefs up here, those overlaps would be there.
Absolutely.
It's common.
So, Chief Corrina, in building on from that, I know the conversation's going to end up as we get further into it around the First Nation Fiscal Management Act. But before we get there, I wanted to check with yourself and Chief Joe. What sort of systems and financial assistance are you seeing at the moment to help you with those infrastructure gaps? Or historically over the last 10, 15 years to close those infrastructure gaps? What fiscal management systems are out there and supporting you for those at the moment? Are there any?
There are, and proud to say that it's getting to be better as far as having the ability to work with other organizations to help us close those gaps. Just recently, our community was certified under the financial admin law, which then will allow our community to access capital. And before we became, or we were part of this process, we didn't have very much luck accessing the capital that we will need. The other one is own source revenue. So that's basically how we've been continuing to strive forward to develop our infrastructure. Recognition from the provincial and federal government on some of these gaps and new announcements for, like the recent announcement for on and off reserve housing for members of First Nations. All these things are.
Tell us more about that initiative, actually.
Well, it was an announcement. I can't remember the exact amount, but the announcement came down from the federal government that there would be monies available, except it's a really tedious process, believe me, to access it. And so there would be monies available for housing for First Nations, regardless where they lived, which was, that was the key part of it, because previously, if we are on reserve, then, and we're going to access money for on reserve, it has to be on reserve housing. So our residents that don't live in our communities were suffering, and sometimes like their living conditions are horrible, but we couldn't help them with that funding that we're getting. So the new announcement, so it's these new initiatives that are coming forward that I think is going to create an environment for our leadership to move forward in a positive way. And it's not only housing. There's infrastructure dollars available. There's also, with the federal government, does the dissolving of they call themselves ISCNA, formerly DIA, formerly INAC. The dissolving of that will allow us to enter into a 10-year contribution agreement. The funding that we get currently from the Department of Indian Affairs is not, it's not a lot of money, but we're able to combine that into a 10-year agreement and then start being creative at the community level. So, yeah, I think there's stuff out there if we really pay attention and work towards accessing some of the funding that is available. Then I think it'll start improving in our communities. I'm hoping.
Good. Glad it's going in the right direction. And Chief Joe, what are you seeing on this?
Well, we've done a number of very exciting things in Ontario over the last 5 or 6 years. First of all, we negotiated a preferred rate with Hydro One that gave us a discount on the bonding or on the share rates. And so we've invested almost 100% with all First Nations in Ontario that there were so many offerings made. We asked for 10% of the offerings that were made and received them from the government. And it's over a long-term period where, in fact, we obviously have to pay down the debt, which we're not opposed to, carrying down that debt. And then that's not going to really kick in for about 20 years. Prior to that, I negotiated Casino Rama, that's on Miskokomon First Nation. That turns over about $120 million a year to all the First Nations in Ontario, which is divided by population, location, size, and so on. There's a formula that goes with that. So speaking to the own source revenue, we have to have innovative ways. I'm currently negotiating for the tobacco tax and cannabis tax and gas tax that is being generated within First Nations. We estimate the unrealized tax of untaxed tobacco to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about $500 million in Ontario, probably in the neighborhood of another $100 million for gas tax, and who knows what the joint is going to bring. we haven't done the math around that one yet. But government is very, very slow. When you start talking about taxes, they see themselves as the only collector of tax. Well, we're governments too, and we need to have a tax base. So if we can't get into projects that are dealing with natural resources that are going to have ownership, you're looking at your best partners. 30 years ago, when we negotiated on the Constitution, they said, you have nothing in treaties. Well, guess what? We won 45 Supreme Court cases that prove that there is meaning to treaty, that there is meaning to Aboriginal title, that we do have a stake in this country, that we do have a stake in this economy. That's yet to be realized. We need partners to help build that. And we need to negotiate for the transmission of hydroelectric power, for the transmission of gas and oil. I don't care if people believe whether or not gas or oil is good or bad. It's a reality of life, it's there. You know, why do we sit on the sidelines within our own territory and not catch part of that? This is what we're trying to say to Canada. This is what we're trying to say to industry. Be a partner of ours. Let's figure out how we do the consultation. Let's figure out how we do the consent. Let's figure out where we're going to go with these projects. And let's take ownership in that. If not, be the proponents of that gas line or of that transmission tower. Zogeen, Cape Croker, connected to transmission that they're currently buying and operating from the Bruce nuclear plant just outside of Toronto to Milton. There's a dam in Northern Ontario that's owned by the Mattawa Tribal Council. They're supplying power to the grid. Those are the kinds of initiatives that First Nations are seeking. IBAs, they're a thing of the past. Yes, they're good for a short term, but we don't want short-term economies. We want long-term shares and involvement. That's how we get out of poverty.
So what I'm hearing, Chief Joe's very important message there, it's about First Nation projects that are being led by First Nations as well, which is where I think, you know, where we're heading into this First Nation Fiscal Management Act, which has been put in place. And I know it's, you know, there's still some years to come and some bedding down to do. And Alan, not to put you on the hot seat here, but we're going to. You, for your sins, you know, played a key role in the First Nation Fiscal Management Act when you were with the government, and that's fantastic. And we're very, very appreciative of that. So what we'd love you to tell us now is, how is that going to make what you're hearing here better? What are the instruments it's providing the First Nation communities to try and step that forward?
Thanks for that. I do also want to recognize one traditional territory of the Mississauga of New Credit. I was a little bit uncomfortable coming here just because I'm not used to speaking to people without PowerPoint. And at Indian Affairs, you're only allowed to interact with Canadians through the medium of PowerPoint. And I've recently retired, and then the year before I retired, 6 people were disciplined in the department for writing complete sentences. But I digress. It's okay to laugh at public service. Some of the big laughs I would get were when I go to the community and say, I'm from Ottawa, I'm here to help. But I do want to talk about something that is, I think, a little helpful. And although it doesn't currently respond to some of the issues that are being raised by the chiefs, there's the potential to do some good with it. And it's something called the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. It's a piece of legislation that essentially provides a statutory basis through which Canada, in my opinion, recognizes the right of Indigenous people to exercise jurisdiction over taxation and financial management. It also creates a finance authority that operates somewhat like provincial finance authorities working on behalf of municipalities to raise money. And so this regime is First Nations led. It creates a jurisdiction and provides the statutory basis for exercising the jurisdiction. It It also creates a number of institutions, the First Nations Tax Commission, the First Nations Financial Management Board, and the First Nations Finance Authority that work together to manage and set standards that are related to the regime. And it works completely independently for the most part from government. And so while Order and Council appointments put people on the boards of these institutions, with the exception of the Lands Authority, it's basically run by the institutions themselves. So the Tax Commission approves borrowing and revenue raising laws for First Nations. The Financial Management Board certifies and develops standards for financial management processes and performance. And then the Finance Authority raises money in the bond market for First Nations that qualify for the in the regime. And currently there's about 230 First Nations that have scheduled themselves to the Act. There's over 130, I believe, First Nations that have been, whose financial performance has been certified, and I think there's about 100 that are eligible board members of the Finance Authority. And since 2014, the Finance Authority has raised over $500 million in the capital markets through the issuance of bonds. And those bonds are being used to pay for infrastructure, housing, wastewater, any number of different public works. So it's basically a regime that allows or provides the tools through which First Nations can raise money for public works.
And Alan, on that, I know we were talking previously, in a conversation earlier. Out of those financial raises, the last 5 financial raises that have been done under the Act, I understand the last 2 of those have been oversubscribed by double. So where the Act is having great level of success in attracting capital to fund these projects. Is that the case, the unwritten case that's going on?
There's a whole bunch of different things that are going on, or in many cases not going on, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, the regime has been quite successful in terms of selling the bonds into institutional lenders, to pension funds, and it's raised a lot of money, and it has a lot of credibility. The bonds are rated by Standard & Poor and the other one.
Dun & Bradstreet.
No. Anyway, but there are rating agencies that rate the bonds, and they have good ratings. I think A+ in one case and A in the other. So it goes a long way in helping kind of finance infrastructure. Like part of the problem with Canada, because Canada provides a lot of funding for infrastructure and housing, is that Canada is basically funding infrastructure, not financing infrastructure. And so if you want to build homes on a reserve, it's a pay-as-you-go model. It's kind of cash-based, and it's managed mainly through contribution agreements. It's not really a financing arrangement, as people in this room would be familiar with. At the same time, there's innovations that could happen through regimes like the Fiscal Management Act, where you could be taking a more innovative approach to how you're actually spending the money. So the 10-year agreements, for instance, if you could monetize those agreements over the course of the lifespan of that contribution agreement, you could theoretically be raising money through the help of almost guaranteed federal transfers. But again, Canada is very reluctant or conservative in terms of its outlook on how it's financing or funding projects on reserve.
Thanks, Alan. So just a question on that funding that's been raised to date. Has that been apportioned or appropriated to matching projects?
Yeah. So the regime, creates, you have to have approved revenues and you have to have approved projects in order to raise the money, and so that's all kind of transparently presented. But it's basically right now the regime is raising money through First Nations, other sources of revenues. They're not using federal transfers or taxation to raise the money. The bonds so far have exclusively raised on the basis of other sources of revenues that are being earned by First Nations, maybe through a power purchase agreement or some Casino Rama money, for instance. That all can be securitized. But currently, federal transfers aren't securitized. And there's even some of the things, as Chief Joe was saying, like taxation. The FNGST is not an eligible revenue for purposes of the bond, and that's just a decision of the government of Canada to make. There's nothing that prevents Canada from allowing that to be, securitized.
Thanks, Alan. And Jason, you've been waiting so patiently to get into this conversation, so I'm happy to be moving to your area now, which is the First Nation Infrastructure Institution. And, you know, there's a range of investors in this audience. There's a range of people who want to assist with projects. There's government people here represented. We've got an array of people with different interests that are in the audience. Now, we're talking and hearing a lot about the financing side and that these debentures have been oversubscribed and so forth, and that there's a Fiscal Management Act that's in play. How are we going on the projects being shovel-ready for these infrastructure projects? And I know that you're with the First Nation Infrastructure Institution, so walk us down that road.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, and I too want to acknowledge that we're here on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit, and grateful to be here this afternoon. I have been working on an initiative called the First Nation Infrastructure Institution. The idea of this would be a new institution to join the other three that Alan mentioned that have been established by the Act. I want to acknowledge Alan Claxton, who's sitting here in front. He's our Development Board Chair, who's helping to provide leadership in the development of this institution, and Joe is serving on the development board as well. So we have a number of other leaders from across the country that are providing input and guidance. And you're exactly right on point that the question has arisen. Well, for the 230 First Nations that have chosen to use the Act, they're having some success in using it, but of course there's room for improvement. And one of the things that appears to be a challenge is getting projects ready to go to be financed. We're seeing more money become available, and so some of the First Nations who are using the Act have come forward and said, you know what, I think there's a few missing pieces here. Let's work together and see if we can improve it and establish something like an Indigenous Infrastructure Ontario, for example, or an Indigenous Partnerships BC. It wouldn't be exactly like those, or SAS Build, but would there be a center of excellence that could provide support to, you know, relatively small governments that aren't going to build 10 water treatment systems in their life? They're going to build one, but can there be an organization like that that would provide that support? And what would it do? So we've done some work over the last year to have some guidance and input from industry leaders, like some of you I see in the audience, like Len, who've come forward and said, here's a few ideas from First Nation leaders. And we've heard a few things over that period of time. We've heard that, yes, longer term transfer agreements would be helpful. If we could have some 10-year agreements or longer, maybe we could put that together with some of our own source revenue, develop a capital plan that meets our membership interests, and then maybe we can, if we have a good enough procurement process that makes sure we're going to transfer some risk and get the stuff built on time, on budget, then maybe the federal government will be willing to let us monetize some of those transfers. And in doing so, I think that makes it pretty interesting. That it's really for every First Nation in this country that could possibly use it. I know that was one of the criticisms, right, Joe, at the start of the Fiscal Management Act, that some said, well, this is fine for so-called rich bands or the so-called haves that were maybe located close to an urban center or had some revenue coming in. But what we've seen actually over time is all sorts of communities using this. Remote communities, fly-in communities in Manitoba, for different reasons, they want to start developing the tools, and they're stepping forward and choosing to do that on their own terms. And it seems to be a really effective approach, the optional approach. So that's similar to what we think for FNII, is an opt-in amendment to the Fiscal Management Act. There would be a center for excellence and establish some standards in a similar fashion to what the Financial Management Board does for financial performance. They establish standards and thresholds that have to be met. The Tax Commission for tax laws. What would FNII do for procurement, for example, in terms of planning requirements, in terms of procurement analysis, and in terms of carrying it out? And if you met that threshold, what would that enable you to do in combination with a financial management certification and a borrowing law with the finance authority, now you're maybe in a position, and if it's standardized, I know we've heard a few different people that, geez, these deals are so small. But what if we were standardizing the process? Would that provide a bit more confidence to the people who are working in the industry that we could start to really talk about things like bundling projects together? Now that starts to get pretty exciting, I think, to really see some real change. And you know, I know part of the challenge is sometimes there's a little bit of competitiveness between our communities, and sometimes we don't work that well together. But what we're finding, I think, is
Let's face that way again.
Not me, no, but I know. I mean, but that was the case. Like, I'm from Squamish. We had these sort of competitive issues with our neighbors, and more we seem to be working together with Muskokomon, Leween, and we see Corrina's community working together with her neighbors on different projects. When you have an economic incentive, maybe to work on a project that's going to provide some revenue stream, maybe that's a reason to work together, and then maybe that leads to other things. Who knows? Maybe you're all of a sudden bundling your community centers together. So anyways, interesting times, and we're just in the development process of this, so we're really looking forward to hearing from people who are in the industry too. What do people in the industry need to have the confidence that they'd be able to engage with us on some of these projects?
Thanks, Jason. It's interesting because there is such a size diversity and different places that different First Nations are along on this journey, right? So those who may not have had as much experience as yours, Chief Joe, you know, do you see this institute as being a great source of resources to support those groups? Is there a big onerous responsibility to comply under the Act? Is the bar too high for a lot of the smaller First Nation communities? Do you think? Go ahead.
Well, you know, there has to be a standard. Everybody understands that.
Yeah.
The issue of capacity in order to achieve those standards is another issue. The bundling process that my friend talks about here, for the Anishinabek that have 40 First Nations, we are currently doing an entire assessment of our water and wastewater needs and requirements, and it breaks down to basically two things. Yes, you need the construction and you need the physical facility to manage that. Equally important, you need the human resource capacity at the same time. The systems that we have today in each of our First Nation are all independent systems, which requires, if you think of it, a water maintenance man literally having to be in that community 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to ensure that that water system is up and running. And in some places, they don't have the internet connections in order to have the monitoring take place. So we're also now moving forward to say, okay, what do we need with our 40 communities? What do we need in the technological field with our 40 communities to get high-speed internet into that? Are there areas that we should have for centralization, for efficiency purposes, a monitoring center that can be connected either by internet or by satellite? What are those things? So it's not just putting pipes together. It's actually the support and the backup that's going to continue to maintain at a high degree of excellence the quality, so that we can have assurance within our communities that they're receiving clean water, right? And in many of our communities, they're far from clean water. And so you compound that then and say, well, what is the risk if in fact you get E. coli in your lines? What's the risk? So at Chippewa, we've got 300 and some homes that is being serviced by one station. And so the insurance that our community has is $10 million for one incident. That means you've got $10 million if something goes wrong with your water system over 300 plus homes. of over 1,200 people, 1,500 people living there. I'm telling you, our First Nation is living on a thread. If something goes wrong, right? There's danger here. So it's not only having the kind of system that pumps it out, but having all of those support things that municipalities have that we don't have. So we're going to have to, at some point, Jason, you're going to have our own insurance company. We're going to have all of those kinds of things.
Do that next, Jason. Thanks.
All of those things that are going to support, to give investors and give people assurance that we're at least moving in that direction. We're aware of it. We know the risks. And we're doing those risk assessments now in order to go back to Infrastructure Canada and say, you know, your suggestion of so many $1 billion was a nice gesture, but you're really going to need around $50 billion in order to address it.
Jason.
Yeah, I really never thought we'd start talking about insurance, but here we are. But it's come up repeatedly. I just say that not jokingly because it's come up actually repeatedly. We've heard that from different people, so I know it's an issue we're going to have to talk about. I just wanted to respond also to the capacity issue, and we know, like Chief Joe says, there's different communities at different capacities. One of the roles of each of the institutions right now is capacity development. So each of the institutions sets standards. The Financial Management Board partners a lot with the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association for personal, individual capacity development. They provide some services to help First Nations get to that threshold to meet that standard. The First Nation Tax Commission, in a similar way, they have a school with Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops. They do a lot of capacity development there. And certainly I know from the input we've heard so far, we've heard that capacity, just setting a standard and leaving people to it is not that helpful. Setting the standard and supporting communities to achieve that standard is something that needs to be done. And with that in mind, we haven't, I don't think, resolved any of the nature of what those services would be, but is it something similar to the Circuit Riders program where there's current training offered to people? Is it other training in operations and maintenance? Are there other training areas with respect to procurement? I don't know, we'll have to go through those, but certainly capacity development is something that we've heard is important.
Thanks, Jason. Chief Corrina, on what you've heard about the Fiscal Management Act and the Institute here today, are you hearing additional things that you think your community could benefit from?
Yeah, our community has moved forward in the direction that will allow these companies or the different acts that have been developed around what are the needs for the people back home. So we've actually been moving in that direction with regards to becoming part of the financial admin law. In our community, we've done a comprehensive community plan that outlines the needs of our community. And then we're taking that plan, and off it is like the spin-off of the comprehensive plan is all the requirements for our community and all the supports that are out there that could assist us in some of the work that we need to do back home. So we've been moving in that direction on our own, and being a semi-isolated community, there is not a lot of economic opportunity in our area, but we're using the comprehensive plan to have that economic, sustainable work back home for our people. And taking not your everyday idea or not your everyday highway, going through our community to have an economic base, but we're taking different strengths we do have in our natural resources and using that to develop our community. So it's with the support of, these organizations and the hard work that people do, knowing the needs of our community that really do help us. And I heard connectivity a couple times. That's one of our downfalls as well, is the connectivity issue in our community. But we're really trying to utilize what we do have, and then having that database that we can rely on.
That's good to hear. And Alan, with where this conversation is headed around the Act, with your intimate knowledge of the Act, are there areas that you think there's version 2 that should come out that should be addressing X, Y, or Z to make the usability of the Act that much more enhanced? Is that something that you can foresee in the next few years?
Well, there's already a number of different ideas and recommendations that are coming from the institutions and the First Nations that are part of the regime.
Okay.
One of them is the monetization of federal transfers, which I think is the direction, the future, if we're going to turn the corner on any of these infrastructure shortfalls or housing shortfalls. And just a bit of information was, the government in the last 2 budgets gave historic amounts of funding to support First Nation housing. That historic investment is going to result in and these are the government's own numbers, somewhere in the order of 65 homes, either new or rehabilitated. But the gap in housing right now in reserve is well over 100,000 homes, and it's increasing. So if you're still going to spend the money like cash, you're not going to put a dent in the problem. And so you have to think harder about how you're actually financing housing and not just, as I said earlier, funding homes. And so I think there has to be some thought given to how you're going to spend the federal money more effectively and more efficiently. I think the First Nations Institute is necessary, particularly if Canada wants to be more creative about and innovative of how it spends its own money, because you're going to want to partner with the Institute so that First Nations have the capacity and they have the standards and the capacity that's going to be developed through the institution. Because Canada's going to want to do that. Right now, the money that is being borrowed against is First Nations' own money. And so Canada's, it's not Canada's money, so it's a credible system and it's working well. But Canada doesn't have the same interest in how that money is being used as it would if they were spending public money. And so there'd be a greater imperative on Canada to make sure that in 10 years from now you've got those agreements supporting homes that are still there, are still functioning, or whether it's health centers or nursing centers. There's all kinds of different infrastructure that you could be using federal transfers to monetize. There's also looking at different types of entities that are eligible for the regime. Right now, it's limited to First Nation governments. You could be opening that up to aggregations of First Nations. You could open it up to housing authorities. You could open up to health authorities, who all have their own institution or infrastructure needs. And so instead of having just First Nations borrowing, aggregated First Nations borrowing, you could also have different authorities in there doing different things as well. And if you're if you're trying to get into the business of monetizing federal transfers, I mean that's also going to be part of the regime as well. You're going to want that necessarily. The other thing too is just in terms of existentially, I suppose. This government talks about a nation-to-nation relationship, and a nation is not a First Nation band as defined under the Indian Act. A nation is something that exercises jurisdiction in those areas that are important to its community and its people. And so when I look at something like the Fiscal Management Act, although it wasn't necessarily created in the era of reconciliation or nation to nation, it does, in a way, Canada is declaring in some manner the First Nations have jurisdiction in the limited area here, at least, of financial management and taxation. It may not be broad enough, it may not be expansive enough, it may not be complete enough, but you could be applying the same theory to all kinds of other different things the First Nations are responsible for to their people. And so I think that, don't give me programs, give me institutions. I think that's what people say in the world of development. That's what we should be thinking about here, is building the institutional capacity of First Nations to exercise a jurisdiction that is important to delivering, services and benefit to their people. And right now, it's not, we're a long way from that. And it's mainly, to a large extent, because Canada and Indian Affairs, for instance, is really stuck in a contribution agreement management mode. They fund education through contribution agreements. It just makes no sense. But yet, you have First Nations who have the capacity, and particularly in an aggregated sense, to deliver these programs and services with support of Canada. but certainly the Fiscal Management Act demonstrates that if you do build the machine, it can actually function quite well.
That's great, Alan.
Editorial.
And no, there's some very, very important points there, and I can see Jason wanting to comment. And then we've got a very excited audience here sending in questions, and I encourage the audience to do that. We'll go to Jason, and then we'll spend the final 10 minutes on the question answers session, I think.
Yeah, I really liked Alan's, the way he described about, assuming jurisdiction over things through the act. And, it just seems to me from a sort of public finance perspective, there's certain things that a local government, like a First Nation government, should have jurisdiction over. Land management makes a ton of sense. Shouldn't be managed in Ottawa. We should do it ourselves. Fiscal management, the same thing. We should handle it ourselves. Local taxation makes a ton of sense for us. And it seems to me infrastructure might be a reasonable thing for us to assume jurisdiction over. And so, if we do that, like that's maybe the philosophical approach, but then what does that imply? The current system, we know isn't working very well, similar to the way that land management didn't work very well when Ottawa was managing it. What do we need to do to make a better system? And what would make you as private sector people who are involved in the system have confidence? What makes you have confidence more in something like Infrastructure Ontario than maybe you would with the province of Ontario? I don't know what specifically those are, or what would make you have more confidence in a procurement process that Partnerships BC has run, as opposed to the government of BC, that they're not going to build a convention center that goes way over budget. They're going to build a Canada line, or how can we do that in a way that's more specific to First Nations, that's going to allow First Nations to have some local control because it's their priority, it's their infrastructure, they need to have a say in it, but provide that, I think, institutional support to help them build the capacity to get there. So anyways, I was just thinking about the questions there, just about, about RFPs and the current system, and that's what makes me think the current system is frustrating, I think, with Canada, people. And if we can build something that the private sector has a little bit more confidence in, that would be quite helpful.
Well, let's move right into that. That was a very good segue. Thank you very much. So just a reminder to the audience, if you'd like to get a question up, please send it in now. But one of our audience members has sent in the question, are there any RFPs out or pending for water or wastewater projects for First Nations in Ontario? And if there are, where would you find them? Where are they posted? So who would like to have a strike at that answer?
So there's probably a few places that one could inquire. Tribal councils in many of the Ontario in the areas take up the capacity issue in order calling for RFPs and doing some of that technical work at the baseline with communities. Some communities, so tribal councils is a good place to look at and find out what their database is. I know the Anishinabek, we will have our final report probably done by, I'm guessing, but before Grand Council next summer. So there's I know there's some resolutions moving forward. We're moving to our fall assembly in the next 2 weeks. So I know there's some infrastructures information coming forward there. We'll probably have some drafts. So at one point, I think the Anishinabek is for the 40 communities that we represent would be a place to look at and say, what are the actual needs before we get to RFPs, and how do we start sorting those things out and looking at the magnitude really of the size of the problem, because the data information simply was not available. And surprisingly enough, when we went to Indian Affairs and said, where are your reports on water and wastewater? And at what level and at what stage are they couldn't provide us any information. They really couldn't provide us the information. We had to physically go out and start doing our own data collection and analysis. And we got the tribal councils involved in order to help in that data collection and so on. There's First Nation Technical Service branch that's here in Toronto. They collect data, they help and assist First Nations that do some of that work. So there's not one place where you look for everything. It's kind of here, there, all over, depending on where those communities have developed relations, close relations, usually at the tribal council level, because they're more hands-on with communities. At an organizational level, you get kind of farther away from that, but we're doing that kind of work just to start looking at if an institution, First Nation infrastructure, or something similar were to come along. Are we ready enough to even say, where do we have water? Where do we have water crisis? Where do so we've come to understand the magnitude, at least internally, with what we're looking at, because we would hope that at some point in time that when Indian Affairs says we're going to get out of the way, we're going to have to be ready in order to catch that ball.
Yeah, so there's a lot of structures and procedures and streamlining to be put into place. Sounds like you're going to be very busy, Jason, so it's good to see that, recognising the need. Okay, moving on. They're coming thick and fast now. Come on, audience. What is the one thing that the private sector could do to help First Nations help improve the First Nations Infrastructure Institute go forward? I think let's broaden that to what could the private sector do to help First Nations in this topic that we're talking about with the infrastructure. So how about Chief Corrina?
Well, I truly believe in communication. So I think one of the biggest things is the communication between what are the current needs and paying attention to the First Nations Infrastructure Institute and what kind of data is it gathering, and is there a place within the private sector to be more supportive in what some of the needs are in our individual First Nations communities and straight across Canada.
Thanks, Chief. Jason, did you want to respond to that before we move on to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned trying to understand what the private sector needs to have confidence in the system, and that would be great. More specifically, we have a draft business plan. It's up on our website, FNII.ca. Please go to the website, have a look. Please contact us. We'd love to get your input. This year, we have more technical work being undertaken on roles and responsibilities for the institution and for regional initiatives, because as Joe mentioned, there are lots of regional initiatives around the country that are doing excellent work. The Ontario Technical Services Group is one. There's a group in Alberta that provides technical services. And so we're going to try and do some process maps about what are the roles and responsibilities to prove the concept. We'd love to have your input as we continue to do that work. So please, if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards.
And Jason, I think, in the theme of this discussion today as well, it's clearly coming through too about having the project shovel ready in a way that can be packaged up to progress. There's that's a distinct space that you need to do a lot of preparation for. And I'm sure that's something that the private sector could assist with as well in coming forward. So I'll leave that on that topic. Talking of housing needs being 100,000 plus, when we were just talking before, questions come in, how do we solve that in a large scale way? So who's got their super cape on and would like to...
I don't have a super cape, but
Okay.
I have a couple of housing is extremely complex.
It is.
There are some groups in the country, regional groups in BC, for example, wanting to establish a housing authority. At FNII, we're talking more about infrastructure. So does that mean we support housing or not? Well, it gets a little complex if I think about a plan a community might have for some market housing, long-term leasehold, some member housing, maybe some commercial development, some health center. You have these multiple uses, and in the process of developing a balanced capital plan that can generate some revenue and using some of your transfers, you have an opportunity really to build the infrastructure, like Joe mentions, that supports that house. Now, does that mean you're paying for the house or not? That's a separate question that I think has some other complexities related to land title and being on reserve. But I think the idea of FNII is, let's have a more balanced approach to infrastructure. It's not just social infrastructure, it's social and economic. And by providing the economic infrastructure, we're providing employment and places for people to work, and also support for that infrastructure that supports the housing. So I definitely don't have an answer to that. That's a very complex, very challenging question.
Good question, whoever
Excellent
asked
question.
it.
But I think we have a couple of ideas about how FNII might address it. Yeah.
Thanks, Jason. Oh, go ahead, Alan, please.
Yeah, I mean, on the housing side, I mean, it's, you know, it's not one size fits all. There's, you know, differentiated approaches. Different communities have different conditions. They're in different locations. They have different access to economic development opportunities. There's different styles of housing markets and different reserves across Canada. And if you listen to Canada, you'd think that the only homes that are being built on a reserve are being paid for by the federal government, which is also not true. So you've got already a number of models out there that are helping communities meet their housing requirements. And you know, but you're going to have differences in terms of people's ability, both financially and capacity-wise, to kind of close the gap. I think the Fiscal Management Act is an example where, you know, there is an innovation around financing that you could be applying more aggressively to the housing problem. Canada could also be more innovative and creative about how it spends its own money. It's really, again, I go back to this, it's the pay-as-you-go cash basis, and it has to figure out that it has to, you know, recognize that there's different models out there that different people are using, and adjust themselves to those different models. And all of a sudden, instead of, you know, Canada paying, you know, for a house, Canada is financing a series of different houses in a series of different ways.
Thanks, Alan. I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I would like to thank each of our panel members today because they've been so very generous with their time and ability to be so open about this hard topic that we've got in front of us. But it's heading in the right direction. I think there's a lot of goodwill up here, so it'll step forward in the right direction. I'm sure that each of the panel members would be open if anyone had any further questions, because we have a red light that's been flashing at us because we've been so engrossed in our conversation. So I'd like to do a vote of thanks, and if everyone could show their appreciation. Thank you. If you have some questions, please come on up. Thank you, everyone.